Now that we have sort of oriented ourselves to what this lead is designed to achieve and the effects it has on each of the players' EVs, let's take a closer look at the details of the strategies. So, of course, the small blind leading range here is very much centered around top pair. Small blind has a bunch of pretty good top pair, and that is mostly where the leads are coming from. The occasional sets are leading actually quite infrequently. Those hands prefer to check. And, if you think back a little to what I was just saying about inducing more betting from the cutoff, you make your sets win more by leading other hands so that you can free up the cutoff to bet more often, and you can get your check raises in with the set against that bet. Whereas when you are dark checking, it just checks through a bunch more. So you are actually getting extra value from these hands by having the lead, even when they do play passively. But as far as what you're actually betting with, it is mainly top pair. Decent amount of second pair as well, actually. You're betting these second pair hands quite often. Other pairs less so, although, ace-3 is a fine bet. Under pairs are not mistakes to bet. And then bluffing with a little bit of a bunch of stuff. You do have just this one gut shot occasionally, which is a decent hand to bet with. And then just betting a bunch of the unpaired cards around the 10, basically. Or even stuff like King 6 that interacts with the low straight draw. Really, a little bit of betting with everything, only a few pure checks here with, 9, 8, 8, 7, King 9, Ace 9 type of stuff. Pulling your bluffs from a little bit of everything some of the time. And looking at the response to the lead, of course, you will probably be unsurprised to see the big blind at this node playing a strictly passive strategy. The big blind has a kind of weak range, and there's a stronger range left to act behind that is going to do a bunch of raising. So it is, once again, one of these very common spots where trapping with your best hands is going to strictly dominate playing them aggressively, and once that's true, it becomes hard to build any kind of sensible raising range. You just call and wait to see what the in-position player will do. Call, and again, no surprise here, we see a very aggressive response from the cutoff, folding around 2/3 of the time. Of your 35% to continue, only 10 of it is calling, the other 25 is raising. Basically, shapes that we have come to expect from these kinds of nodes. I'm not going to go too deep on the details here. It's maybe getting a little bit repetitive at this point. This node works how you think it will. And then stepping back quickly and looking at the big blind fold. Again, this node also works about how you think it will. Closing the action, heads up, in position, leaving behind an SPR of only around 1.5. The cutoff plays a mostly passive strategy with a little bit of raising for protection with the good, not great kind of vulnerable hands, Ace 10, King 10, Jacks, and a smattering of other things that slot into a raising range well, 8s and 7s a little bit, and a little bit of various unpaired stuff, a little bit of Ace 5. The sets are pure slow playing. Queens are better or pure slow playing. Very normal stuff that you would expect to see at this type of node. And now I also want to step back and look at what happens after the check. check. Big blind always checks. And you see the cutoff playing this shape that we have come to expect from in position, last to act with a strong range, high frequency, small size. Very, very little checking with the top of the range. Here we see some checks with exactly top set. The other sets are pure betting. The overpairs are pure betting. The better top pairs are pure betting. Seeing a little bit of checking with Jack 10, 10, 9, 10, 8. Lots of checking with 9s and 8s. Once again, everything you have come to expect at this type of node. Kind of quite a similar shape to, say, what we saw on the Ace-9-6 Rainbow, or even a lot in common with what we saw in the Jack 8-3 Rainbow for the button. Not too much to say about all of this. Of course, again, we do have the small frequency size up. And again, I don't think that this is important. There are no hands using it pure. I think there's every reason to think that using only the small size will capture all of the EV here and make your life a little easier. Although, if you want to size up with some hands in practice because you think your opponents will not play great against it, you just like making things complicated, that is also certainly fine. That is a decision I make in practice fairly often myself. You can go either way there. So, small bet for the cutoff. It's back on the small blind, and we see quite a lot of folding here, and a lot of raising from the continues. Close to pure raising the top pair, or the good top pair, some calling with 10-9, 10-8. The sets are doing some raising and some calling. Of the hands that continue, it looks like Ace-9 is the only one that's pure call. This is kind of one of those spots where you want to hit your frequencies right, but any individual hand can mostly just slot into whatever range. With King 10, Ace 10, I think you would be making a mistake to miss the raise, but other than that, kind of do what you want node. And again, also looking fairly similar to the small blind in Ace-9-6. So you have this kind of thing going on here where once the small blind checks, having now led a bunch of stuff, you create a set of ranges where the cutoff gets to play similarly to how the cutoff played on Ace-9-6, because the small blind has sort of weakened their own range and freed up the cutoff. And all of these nodes from here after the cutoff bet are going to have roughly similar shapes to what we saw on the Ace-9-6 board, give or take. This is a bit more dynamic, and now we're going to see a bit more aggression. So after the small blind fold, the big blind is not quite on the strictly call plan that we saw on the Ace-9-6 board, but very much that shape, and just squeezing in a little, like 5-6% frequency to raise, centered around King 10 and Queen 10. The two pairs are slow playing, but exactly this good top pair region does want to just go ahead and start putting the money in, because as we noted at previous nodes, this is a bit more dynamic of a board. These hands want protection and want to play aggressively, and then you match some relatively intuitive bluffs to that, mainly hands with some straight outs or a little bit of the lower pairs, some king high backdoor, queen high backdoor, jack high backdoor stuff. This 9-8, 8-7, 8-6 with backdoor is potentially a little unintuitive. Those do look like pretty bad hands. They can't turn top pair. But the backdoor straight draws are nice, and they are a good combos to bluff with across later streets very often. So, yeah, all pretty intuitive stuff here. Stepping back and looking at bet raise and back to the big blind. Once again, we're seeing something kind of similar to the ace-9-6 board, but with some adjustment for the fact that it's a bit more dynamic. Now we see, what is it, 3% raise and 14% call, roughly. So it's mostly that same shape of cold calling the vast majority of your continues, but you have exactly king 10 is just the right combination of strength and vulnerability that it wants to play aggressively, and you match that with some other things. You know, a little bit of queen 10, a little bit worse 10s, some open-enders, some pair of 5s. Again, gonna keep it relatively brief with these nodes, but looking quite similar to that ace-9-6 flop in terms of broad shapes, but with a little bit of aggression sneaking in for the big blind. And after the call, same thing. We saw a little bit of raising at this node on the ace-9-6 board already, and here it is a little bit more. Again, the combo choices and thresholds and all of that, very intuitive. And again, predominantly continuing by calling, but there is enough stuff that wants to raise here. And here in the three-way pot, you are mostly raising top of range. Exactly 10-3 wants to slow play. That's a mechanic you'll see fairly often, that the top and bottom slow plays and the other two pairs play aggressively. Best top pair is pure aggression, and then mixing with some of the others. A lot of patterns that should be looking familiar here of nearly pure aggression with the top of the range at this node, even though it is one where you don't see a ton of aggression. It is very rare to want to close the action three ways, playing passively with strong hands. And lastly, before we move on from this board, I do want to just go back and revisit the cutoff play in the dark check model. So here we had in front of us the model where the small blind is not allowed to lead. So it goes check, check. Sorry. Check, check to the cutoff. And I am often very skeptical of sort of node lock investigations. I think that some of these outputs that people get very excited about with, like, oh, the big blind's not allowed to check raise, how do I change my c-betting strategy? Or I'm locking big blind check raise way too often, what happens from there? Or I force a bunch of checks that don't make any sense for the imposition player. You can get some really artificial looking strategies where the solver will do its best to compensate for the mistake that you're forcing, and it's very inhuman and not necessarily, I think, a useful way to think about how to exploit your opponent's mistakes. But in this case, the small blind doesn't know they're supposed to lead, and they play a dark check. This is a very realistic scenario, and the other players are likely to try to play reasonably while reading their own ranges accurately at this point. So this kind of thing where, oh, what would I do if my opponent doesn't know they're allowed to play a lead in some spot where that's a kind of tricky play? I think this is one of the applications of node locking, forcing a suboptimal strategy from your opponent, and then seeing what the solver does from there. I think this is one of the applications of that is relatively useful, and it is pretty common that you're going to play against opponents who just don't really lead after cold calling from the small blind, and it is worthwhile to know how to adjust. So, I mean, the most obvious thing here is we check a whole lot more. In fact, have a decent number of pure checks here. I can sort by pure check. Certain ace-king combos, certain ace-queen combos. King-queen without a backdoor is pure checking. Very heavy check with generally this kind of ace and king high stuff. Ace-9 and ace-8, king-9, king-8 are heavy to pure check. Just not much very good happens when you bet some of these hands that do well taking a free card, have some chance of showing down for the win unimproved, and don't get a whole lot better stuff to fold. Betting into relatively strong ranges, you just don't bother with a bunch of that stuff. Same with 9s and 8s. Interestingly, also top set here goes from a mixed slow play, I believe, in the original case to a pure slow play here, because with your opponents having stronger ranges, or small blind anyway, having a stronger range when you check behind, more money is going to go in on turns, and that trap becomes a more attractive play. The other thing that you will notice here is that where in the original model, imposition used almost exclusively the small bet, now that we have much more checking, the big bet becomes more attractive. That's a pretty common mechanic that you will see across a lot of different boards in both heads-up and multi-way bots, that as your betting frequency goes down, as your range gets more polar and your value threshold becomes stronger, the bigger bets become more attractive. And this is a good example of it. And it's a good thing to keep in mind that, I think a lot of people have sort of mental shortcuts between board textures and bet sizes. And if you have this filed as a small bet board, then it might not be immediately intuitive that when your opponents are playing suboptimally, that the ranges you're facing once you're against the two checks here change, and even though it's the same board, it now plays very differently, and you want to start using the big size. And here, we can sort by, are there pure big size hands? And sure enough, there are. There are some hands here that are gaining a little bit of EV by using the bigger size rather than the smaller one. A lot of the ace 10, king 10, jacks type of stuff especially. So I do think it is worthwhile to size up. Probably if you had to pick one size, I would just go big size only when you're playing this board versus a small blind who has dark checked. Or probably the most precise and highest EV thing to do is to use both sizes and to have to implement some mixed strategies with a bunch of your hands and slot the hands that make sense into the bigger size or the smaller size more often on average, and build your range accordingly. The pure small size hands here being a lot of the weaker bluffs, but also sets, and some of the top pairs prefer the smaller size. A lot of what's going in the smaller size is the very worst bluffs, but also the sets. So yeah, overall very, very different shape for the cutoff c-bet here when you force the small blind to check, and the cutoff is now facing a considerably stronger range.